The air tasted of rusted metal and forgotten coal dust in the narrow alley beside St. Jude's Asylum. It was the kind of cold that didn't bite sharply, but settled deep within the bone marrow, an insidious, constant ache. Elias, 11 years old and built of stretched skin over sharp angles, stood hunched against the peeling brick wall. His threadbare woolen coat, a hand-me-down 3 sizes too big, absorbed the dampness rather than repelling it, making him feel encased in a heavy, cold shroud. He was waiting for the light to fade completely, preferring the absolute black of late evening to the treacherous, revealing grey of twilight. Matron Agnes, a woman whose voice was a rasping command and whose face seemed permanently set in the severe lines of disappointment, often performed her final rounds just as the gas lamps flickered on the main street. Elias had perfected the art of stillness, of blending into the deep shadows where the refuse bins stood perpetually overflowing. His focus, absolute and consuming, was centered on the small, irregular lump held tightly in his right palm. It was his ration of hard, day-old bread, usually reserved for the midnight stomach cramps that always followed the meager supper. Tonight, the hunger was a hollow drumbeat just beneath his ribs, louder and more insistent than usual, perhaps because the evening meal had been particularly watery potato soup. Elias lifted the bread slowly, bringing it close enough that the scent, faint and yeasty, briefly overpowered the smell of brine and industrial runoff that permeated Ethelgard. The crust was tough, almost petrified, a defensive shell around the marginally softer interior. He considered the sheer mechanics of eating it, the initial painful scrape against the roof of his mouth, the required effort of chewing until the starch released enough saliva to allow swallowing. It was a transaction of pain for temporary satiation. Just as he raised his arm, preparing to endure the necessary ritual, a sound broke the oppressive silence. It was a low, mournful sigh, followed by a slight scraping noise, like coarse fur brushing against loose gravel. Elias froze, his muscles locking instantly. He held his breath, every nerve ending screaming a silent alert. St. Jude's enforced a cruel isolation. Sounds meant detection, and detection meant the cold, hard slap of Matron Agnes's ruler. The sound came again, closer this time, accompanied by a faint, wet sniffing. Elias rotated his eyes slowly, adjusting them to pierce the gloom at the mouth of the alley. A shape resolved itself from the darkness, not a person, but an animal, a dog. It was large, perhaps a shepherd mix, its coat the color of wet ashes, matted and streaked with mud. It moved with a profound, bone-deep exhaustion, its head lowered, its spine visible beneath the thin hide. It was not snarling or aggressive, it merely existed, a walking monument to destitution, mirroring Elias's own silent suffering. The dog stopped about 5 feet away, its large brown eyes, clouded slightly by dirt and fatigue, fixing on Elias's hand. Not on Elias himself, but specifically on the bread. There was no whine, no bark, only that intense, unwavering gaze of pure, desperate hunger. Elias felt a sharp, unexpected shift in the landscape of his own pain. The drumming hunger in his stomach did not disappear, but it momentarily receded, eclipsed by a wave of crushing, shared empathy. He knew that look. He wore that look every day. He lowered his hand fractionally, the tough bread catching the faint residual light from the nearest lamp-post. He watched the dog's nostrils twitch. The animal was too weak, too defeated even to approach further, held in place by a mixture of exhaustion and perhaps the habitual fear of human cruelty. Elias had been taught all his life that survival was a zero-sum game. Every scrap saved, every ounce of warmth hoarded was a victory against the relentless erosion of the orphanage. To give away this bread, his guaranteed defense against the grinding emptiness of 2 a.m., was an act of sheer, illogical defiance against his own programmed self-preservation. He swallowed hard, the dryness in his throat immense. This was his last physical resource. There was no possibility of finding another crumb tonight. He looked at the dog again. It was visibly shaking, not entirely from the cold, but from the deep expenditure of energy required simply to stand. "Come here," Elias whispered, the sound scratchy and low. He took a careful step backward, pressing his spine firmly against the rough brick, signaling non-aggression. He then moved his hand, not toward the dog, but downward, resting the bread carefully on a slightly cleaner patch of pavement midway between them. The dog didn't move immediately. Its eyes darted from Elias's face to the bread, processing the unbelievable offer. Then, with a slow, cautious stiffness, it began to slide forward. The movement revealed something striking about the animal. Around its neck was a collar. It was not the cheap nylon kind common on strays. This was thick, heavy leather, dark brown, appearing almost black and immensely rigid. It looked far too substantial for the scrawny neck it encircled. It was old, scarred, and somehow out of place on such a neglected creature. Elias dismissed the collar instantly. Collars meant ownership, and ownership meant the dog might belong to someone who would demand it back, or worse, someone who would punish Elias for interacting with it. He focused back on the act of giving. He pushed the bread forward another inch with the tip of his boot, his gesture unmistakable. The dog reached the bread. It did not snap or tear. It merely lowered its head and used its front teeth to lift the entire piece gingerly. Then it retreated a step, positioning itself slightly to the side, maintaining eye contact with Elias as it began to eat. The sound of the dog consuming the bread was loud in the alley, a grinding, crunching noise followed by rapid, satisfied swallows. It was gone in less than a minute. The dog stood still for a long moment, the warmth of the shared food perhaps settling inside it. It licked its chops methodically, and then, slowly, it approached Elias, tentative but resolute. It nudged its wet nose against Elias's cold, chapped hand. The fur was coarse and dusty, but the touch was surprisingly soft. It was the first voluntary, affectionate touch Elias had received in months, perhaps years. Elias felt a sudden, fierce warmth spread through his chest, a sensation far more potent than the relief the bread would have offered. He risked a rapid, gentle stroke along the dog's head, just behind the ears. Cinder, Elias decided, the name popping into his mind, reflecting the color of its coat and the ashes of the alley. "Stay close, Cinder." The dog remained. It lay down in the shadow of the refuse bins, tucking its nose beneath its paws, its heavy leather collar resting awkwardly on the cold stones. Elias, having sacrificed his defense against the night hunger, now felt a new, strange obligation, a fragile thread connecting him to this unexpected companion. He waited until the last of the gas lamps were dimmed, then slipped back through the broken section of the perimeter fence, leaving Cinder asleep in the alley. The hunger returned, but it was muted, overlaid by the residue of that brief, profound connection. The next few weeks defined a new rhythm for Elias. The world of St. Jude's was a sequence of cold chores, thin meals, and the suffocating silence of oppression. The world outside, represented entirely by the presence of Cinder, was a repository of silent acceptance. Cinder was always there. When Elias was forced to empty the kitchen slop buckets outside the rear gate, Cinder would appear, a silent, ghostly presence, waiting patiently. When Elias spent his mandatory 2 hours scrubbing the slate floor of the laundry room, he knew Cinder was curled up just beyond the foundation wall, listening. Matron Agnes had an intense, almost maniacal hatred for stray animals, seeing them as vectors of filth and disorder. If Cinder were discovered, the consequences would be swift and brutal, not just for the dog, but for Elias, who would be blamed for the trespass. This constant, Low-level anxiety became the emotional backdrop of their interactions. Elias began to reserve tiny fragments from his meals, the edge of a potato peel, a stray piece of boiled carrot, or, most precariously, the crust from the rare slice of stale bread. He wrapped these treasures in a scrap of oily paper, tucking them into the inner pocket of his oversized coat, the fabric perpetually damp and smelling faintly of mildew. One afternoon, a sharp, cold rain began to fall, turning the grounds into slippery mud. Elias was tasked with stacking the winter firewood in the dilapidated shed behind the main building. The shed offered temporary shelter from the relentless wind and rain, and Elias knew Cinder would be near. He found Cinder curled tightly inside the shed, attempting to shelter beneath a tarp. The dog lifted its head wearily as Elias entered. "You're soaked," Elias murmured, kneeling beside the animal. He unwrapped the tiny offering, a small, hard heel of bread saved from lunch, and placed it in front of Cinder. The dog ate quickly, then shuddered, attempting to shake the water from its heavy, ash-colored coat. Elias began to rub Cinder's shoulders vigorously with a dry burlap sack he found nearby, trying to generate some warmth. As he worked, his hand repeatedly brushed against the heavy leather collar. It was unlike any collar he had ever seen, even in the brief glimpses of pets owned by the wealthy families who occasionally passed through Ethelgard. It was excessively wide, perhaps 2 inches, and tremendously stiff. It seemed unnaturally rigid, almost like a piece of wood carved into a curve. Elias ran his fingers along the edge. The leather was deeply marked with age, cross-hatched with tiny, almost microscopic scars and scratches. Where the leather buckled around the throat, it was molded perfectly to Cinder's form. Yet it showed no signs of softening or becoming supple. It felt ancient, immovable. There was no visible tag, no metallic inscription, just the sheer, dense weight of the material itself. It didn't look comfortable. In fact, it looked burdensome. "You should have a softer one," Elias whispered, tracing the outline of the brass buckle. The buckle, too, was old, dark with tarnish, and recessed deeply into the leather, preventing any sharp edges from poking Cinder's neck. Elias, driven by the intense need to care for his only friend, felt a fleeting impulse to take the collar off, examine it, and perhaps oil the leather to make it more pliable. But the thought was instantly dismissed. The collar was clearly structural, not just decorative. It looked like it had been riveted on. More importantly, removing it felt like a violation of Cinder's identity, a separation from the mysterious, unknown past that had delivered the dog to the alley. He resumed rubbing the dog dry, the physical contact providing a temporary reprieve from his own chilling dampness. The bond deepened over the following weeks, not through grand gestures, but through silent, persistent presence. Cinder was Elias's anchor, the sole reliable warmth in a freezing existence. But the emotional pressure of keeping Cinder secret began to exact a toll. Elias was losing weight rapidly. The portions he sacrificed were significant to his already starved frame. His movements became slower. His concentration during the mandatory daily lessons, which he usually excelled at, finding refuge in the world of numbers, wavered constantly. His eyes were perpetually shadowed. Matron Agnes noticed. She noticed everything that deviated from her oppressive routine. One bitter morning, the temperature plummeted, coating the courtyard in a dangerous sheen of black ice. Elias, weak from hunger and shivering violently, stumbled while carrying a heavy bucket of slop. The bucket clattered loudly, spilling its contents across the pristine ice near the kitchen door. Matron Agnes emerged instantly, her shadow stretching long and menacing in the weak morning light. The ensuing reprimand was delivered with agonizing slowness, each word a cold, calculated strike. "Negligence. Thorn. Weakness. You are proving yourself incapable of contributing even the smallest measure to this institution," she stated, her voice unnervingly low. "Your pallor suggests illness. Or perhaps theft? Are you hoarding food, Thorn? Are you betraying the charity given to you? Elias stood immobile, his breath fogging rapidly. He knew if she discovered the shared food, if she connected his weakness to the sustenance of a stray animal, the punishment would be severe. Isolation, or worse, placement in the notorious juvenile workhouse on the outskirts of the city. The workhouse was a place of true despair, where the hunger never ended. He denied the accusation silently, forcing his gaze downward, his body rigid. Matron Agnes did not physically strike him, but she imposed a far worse decree, immediate and total restriction. You will remain confined to the dormitory and the main hall for 3 days, Thorn. No outdoor duties, no exceptions. Perhaps this isolation will restore your gratitude. The decree felt like a death sentence, not for Elias, but for Cinder. Elias knew the dog was dependent on his scraps. Cinder had stopped hunting the meager city rats, relying instead on Elias's offerings. 3 days without food in the intensifying cold could be lethal. The urgency gripped Elias instantly, a fear so profound it superseded his own desperate hunger. He spent the first afternoon of confinement in a state of frantic anxiety, staring out the warped glass of the dormitory window at the empty, freezing yard. He had to communicate the change to Cinder or find a way to provide food. When midnight finally arrived, heralded by the deep rattling cough of the clock in the main hall, Elias knew he had to act. The risk of Matron Agnes's late-night patrol was immense, but the image of Cinder starving and freezing was unbearable. He moved with the practiced silence of a shadow, his bare feet barely disturbing the dust motes on the cold wooden floor. He crept down the back stairs, past the sleeping form of the junior caretaker, and eventually reached the kitchen pantry. He managed to pilfer 2 small, hard biscuits, the kind reserved for staff tea, and a small piece of suet, a high-fat item that would provide necessary energy. He wrapped the sweet quickly in his last scrap of clean handkerchief. Exiting the broken fence section was easy. The cold kept everyone inside. The real difficulty was the cold itself. It was a suffocating, crystalline frigidity that burned the lungs with every breath. He found Cinder precisely where he had left him, huddled beneath the tarp in the woodshed, shivering violently. Elias knelt, his knees protesting on the icy, straw-covered ground. "I can't stay long," he whispered, pressing the sweat and the biscuits into Cinder's mouth. Cinder ate without hesitation, the frantic chewing sound heartbreakingly loud. Elias ran his hand over Cinder's freezing back, attempting to impart some warmth. As his hand traveled over the dog's neck, he felt a disturbing stiffness. Cinder's coat was frozen, stiff in patches, and the thick leather collar seemed to be contributing to the problem, holding the dampness close to the skin. Elias felt a surge of guilt and fear. The collar was hurting Cinder. It was too cold, too rigid. He knew he couldn't remove it entirely, but perhaps he could clean the area, rub some residual dryness into the fur around it. He pushed the dense, ash-colored fur away from the collar's edge, revealing the skin beneath, pale, slightly irritated, but thankfully not wounded. The sheer thickness of the leather was astonishing up close. It wasn't just wide, it was almost an inch thick, layered and stitched with unbelievable precision. His fingers probed along the upper edge of the collar, seeking any sign of a seam or a weakness. He felt the weight of it, the incredible density. It was heavier than it had any right to be. As his thumb pressed firmly against the edge, searching for the join near the buckle, he felt a subtle, unnerving rigidity where there should have been the natural curve of leather softening over time. Instead, there was a hard, almost metallic line running parallel to the edge of the leather strap. Curiosity, overriding the urgent need to leave, compelled him to investigate. He needed light. He took the small, dull metal matchbox from his pocket, the one he used to light the kindling in the mornings. He struck a match with trembling fingers. The sulphur flare illuminated the shed momentarily, throwing deep, dancing shadows. He shielded the tiny flame with his cupped hand, bringing the light close to the collar. What he saw made his heart jump against his ribs, not from fear, but from sheer confusion. The collar was not simply thick leather. It was a construct. The outer layer of leather, rough and scarred, was meticulously stitched to an inner component. The light, weak as it was, revealed that where the stitching seemed to end near the buckle, there was a tiny, almost invisible indentation. It looked like a break in the texture of the leather, not a tear, but a deliberate separation. He extinguished the match and immediately struck another, needing confirmation. He bent closer, his eyes mere inches from Cinder's neck. Cinder remained perfectly still, trusting him implicitly. Elias used the tip of his fingernail, already chipped and grubby, and pressed gently into that faint line. There was a faint, dry snap. A section of the outer leather, about 3 inches long, popped slightly outward, pivoting on a hidden hinge near the buckle. Elias gasped, the cold air seizing in his lungs. This wasn't a collar. It was a sheath. He lifted the flap of leather slowly, revealing the compartment beneath. The interior was lined with a soft, supple, expensive-looking suede, a shocking contrast to the rugged exterior. Nestled within this compartment was a small, oblong object. It was a locket, not made of brass or common silver, but of something that seemed to absorb and reflect the tiny match flame with a dull, rich yellow glow. Gold. The locket was barely larger than Elias's thumbnail, intricately designed and surprisingly heavy. It was completely enclosed, possessing no visible chain or loop, perfectly sized to fit the recess in the collar. Elias's mind scrambled, trying to process the meaning of this find. This item was expensive. It was hidden. It meant Cinder was far more than a simple stray. His fingers, numb with cold, carefully lifted the locket out of its suede nest. The weight of it felt enormous in his palm. It was cool to the touch, and under the flickering light he could see that the surface was not smooth. The entire back surface of the locket was covered in minute, tightly packed engravings, text so small it was impossible to read without magnification. It looked like a cipher, a miniature map of letters and numbers etched into the soft metal. This was not a piece of jewelry. This was a document, hidden in plain sight. Elias felt a dizzying combination of terror and awe. Terror because this object represented a world of value and complexity far beyond the alley and St. Jude's, a world that hunted for such things. Awe because it had been entrusted to Cinder, and Cinder had shared its existence with him. The match flame reached his fingertips, burning him instantly. He dropped the match, plunging the shed back into darkness. He fumbled in the dark, quickly snapping the leather cover back over the compartment. It clicked shut, seamless and secure. The collar looked exactly as it had before, old, heavy, and unremarkable. He stood up, swaying slightly. The cold, the hunger, and now this overwhelming discovery conspired to make the shed spin around him. He clutched the tiny gold locket tightly in his fist. He could not leave it in the collar. If Matron Agnes or anyone ever decided to confiscate Cinder, this secret would be lost forever, or worse, used against them. He shoved the locket deep into the lining of his tattered coat, seeking the protection of the thick, damp wool. He looked down at Cinder, whose luminous eyes watched him patiently in the pitch black. "We need to go, Cinder," Elias whispered, his voice trembling. "We need to figure this out." He couldn't leave the dog exposed, not now. The secret bound them together, making Cinder's safety synonymous with his own. He pushed the burlap sack towards Cinder and backed out of the shed. He returned to the dormitory, heart hammering a chaotic rhythm against his ribs. He did not sleep. The weight of the tiny locket against his chest was the only proof that the night's events were real, not some feverish dream induced by starvation. The next 2 days of confinement were excruciating. Elias was physically present in the main hall, forced to sit stiffly on the hard bench. pretending to read the tattered prayer book, but his mind was far away, dissecting the implications of the locket. The immense scale of the secret slowly began to dawn on him. Objects hidden in this manner, objects made of pure gold and bearing cryptic engravings, did not belong to paupers. They belonged to families of immense stature and history. The question hammered relentlessly. If this locket held value, why was Cinder a starving stray? Elias realized that the value of the locket was not monetary in the sense of currency hidden inside, but in the information etched onto its surface. It was a key, a map, or most likely, an identification marker. He needed to read the inscription. On the third day of his confinement, restricted even from using the communal washroom alone, Elias knew he had to find a moment of true solitude and, critically, light and magnification. He finally secured his opportunity during the afternoon chores. The dormitory was empty. The other boys were performing their duties. He was supposed to be folding the scratchy, thin blankets, a task that allowed him to remain alone for a supervised yet private period. He needed the single, unbroken pane of glass in the attic window, which offered the best, if weak, winter sunlight, and he needed the thick magnifying glass used by Matron Agnes to check the schoolwork. Stealing the magnifying glass was risky. It was kept locked in her small office drawer. Elias waited until he heard the matron's heavy footsteps descending the main staircase for her afternoon tea ritual. He had mere minutes. He sprinted down the hallway, the floorboards groaning under his weight, a sound that amplified his terror. He reached her office door, a heavy, dark wood barrier that always smelled faintly of stale tea and starch. He had observed that the lock, an old tumbler mechanism, often stuck. He inserted a straightened hairpin, a piece of scavenged metal he always kept for minor repairs, into the keyhole. He wiggled it gently, listening to the delicate internal clicks. The sweat was cold on his forehead. A final, soft release, and the door sighed open. He slipped inside. The room was sterile and cold, dominated by a large mahogany desk. He located the correct drawer, the middle one, always locked. He used the hairpin again. Click. Inside, nestled beneath a sheaf of damning school reports, was the magnifying glass. Its handle was ornate, silver-plated, and the glass itself was thick, convex, and heavy. He grabbed the glass, slammed the drawer shut, relocked it, and backed out, securing the door. He did not breathe easily until he was back in the dormitory, sitting beneath the attic window, the winter sun filtering through the gritty glass. His hands were shaking as he retrieved the locket from the lining of his coat. The gold was warm now, having absorbed his body heat. He placed the locket flat on the wooden floor and brought the magnifying glass over it, adjusting the distance until the fine micro-engravings snapped into sharp focus. The effect was instantaneous and breathtaking. The markings, previously indistinct scratches, swelled into perfectly formed, elegant script. It was a complex legal document reduced to the size of a thumbnail. He leaned in, his eyes straining, slowly piecing together the formal language. The light was fading fast. The inscription was not a name, but a series of coded references and legal stipulations. It mentioned the Eldridge Trust, beneficiary, line Ethelgard, and contingent heir identity protocol Gamma 7. Then, lower down, where the script curled delicately around the edge, he saw a single defining identifier, EVT Elias Vernon Thorne, his own initials. The realization hit him with the physical force of a blow, knocking the breath from his lungs. He wasn't just an orphan named Elias Thorne, he was the EVT mentioned in this impossibly valuable cryptic document. He lowered the magnifying glass, his vision blurring. The silence of the empty dormitory was immense, threatening to crush him. The $1 million secret was not a diamond or a sack of cash. It was him. Cinder had been carrying proof of Elias's identity, proof that he was the contingent heir to the Eldridge Trust. a legacy rumored to span centuries and control vast tracts of the city's shipping and infrastructure, a legacy thought to have been extinguished in a forgotten tragedy years ago. The shock was paralyzing. His mother and father, whom he barely remembered, had been lost in a fire when he was 4. He had always been told they were simple people, workers, who left him nothing but debt and the charity of St. Jude's. The locket screamed a different truth, a deliberate, calculated concealment. His parents hadn't been simple workers. They had been line ethel guard, forced into hiding, utilizing a complex protocol to ensure the survival of their heir and the continuation of the trust. Cinder hadn't been astray. Cinder had been a protector, a messenger, walking proof of identity. Elias stared at the locket, tracing the EVT with a trembling finger. Why Cinder? Why a dog's collar? Because no one looks closely at a starving stray. No one suspects the conduit of immense wealth to be covered in mud and ash. He understood the urgency now, the gravity of what he held. This locket was the key to his entire future, but it was also a magnet for danger. If the trust was known, there must be others who stood to gain from his failure to claim it. The $1 million secret represented safety, warmth, and food, everything he yearned for, but only if he could successfully unlock its power. He heard the heavy footsteps of Matron Agnes returning from tea. Time was up. He shoved the magnifying glass back into his oversized sleeve and tucked the locket securely back into the lining of his coat, the gold now hot against his cold skin. The transition from hungry orphan to secret heir was instantaneous in his emotional landscape, but invisible in his physical reality. He still wore the threadbare coat. He still ate the thin soup. He still feared the ruler of Matron Agnes. But now, every interaction was filtered through a layer of intense paranoia and calculation. He had to assume the world outside St. Jude's was looking for this locket, or perhaps even for the heir himself, though the trail had been cold for years. He realized the immense sacrifice his parents must have made. They had died not protecting wealth, but protecting him, leaving him in the care of the one creature that would remain loyal and unremarkable. Cinder. The crucial next step was deciphering the contact information. The Eldridge Trust would have agents, lawyers, or guardians meant to activate Protocol Gamma-7 upon presentation of the artifact. The locket was too complex for a child to simply walk into a bank with. He needed more time with the magnifying glass. The following day, Elias faked a violent stomach illness, a performance made all too convincing by his genuine malnourishment. He was allowed to remain in the isolation room, a small, cold, unused closet adjacent to the main supply hall. It was dusty and cramped, but offered the one thing he needed: privacy. He waited until the late afternoon. Matron Agnes would be occupied with the younger boy's mandatory physical training. He managed to retrieve the magnifying glass again, using his knowledge of the stuck lock, and slipped into the isolation room. He pulled the locket out, heart racing with the urgency of a ticking clock. This time, he focused on the microscopic markings around the edges of the primary legal text. His focus was absolute. His eye pressed against the thick glass until his pupil ached. He finally located a separate, minute cluster of engravings, a communication cipher. It was a short sequence, TSV 47. 12. Elias committed the cipher to memory instantly. It looked like an address or coordinates. He understood TSV as must stand for the name of the recipient. He needed a map, something he absolutely did not have access to. He returned the magnifying glass, the transaction completed. He had the key, but not the door. That night, Elias knew he couldn't wait. He was still confined, weak and suspicious. He needed to activate the protocol before Matron Agnes's suspicion solidified into certainty. He had to get Cinder out of the shed and to the specified location. Under the cover of a thick, freezing fog that rolled in from the marshlands, Elias slipped out. He didn't use the back fence. The fog was too thick, the potential for getting lost or caught too great. He chose the front gate, knowing the old lock was loose, requiring only a soft, persistent wiggle. He reached the woodshed. Cinder rose instantly, a dark shadow amidst the pale mist, instantly sensing the change in routine. Elias knelt, rubbing Cinder's sturdy neck. "Listen to me, Cinder. We are going to walk now. You need to follow me, and you need to be silent." He had an idea of where the cipher pointed. 47 and 12 suggested street markers, often used in the industrial, older sector of Ethelgard. D might be a designation for a district or a docking bay. Elias had worked briefly sweeping floors in the main market district several months ago. He remembered the old district maps painted on the walls of the market archway. He needed to get there. The journey was agonizingly slow. The cold was unbearable, sucking the moisture and heat from his body. Every step was a calculated risk. Cinder walked silently beside him, a reassuring weight, staying impossibly close. They walked for nearly an hour, navigating the deserted, fog-choked streets. Elias relied on the faint, unique smell of the nearby river and the sound of the distant, rhythmic pumping of the industrial water treatment plant to keep his bearings. Finally, they reached the old market archway. The air was marginally warmer here, trapped between the ancient stone buildings. Elias located the fading municipal map painted on the stone. He brought his face close. Tracing the grid of the city with his finger, he found it. 47th Street intersected with 12th Avenue, leading directly to the docks. The intersection marked the location of the D, Docking Bay 4, a forgotten narrow inlet used only by smaller, older fishing vessels. TSV. He searched the small print beneath the map legend, the silent vessel. It wasn't a person or a company, it was a fishing boat, a code phrase for a rendezvous point. Elias and Cinder set off again, the urgency now a physical pressure in his chest. His legs felt like lead weights, protesting the extended march. They reached the docks just as the sky began to bleed a pale, watery grey on the eastern horizon. The fog was dissipating, revealing the damp, decaying structures of the harbour. Docking Bay 4 was empty, save for the ceaseless slap of the grey water against the pilings. There was only one small vessel moored there, a tired-looking fishing trawler named the Silent Vessel. Elias approached the trawler cautiously. It was dark, silent, and smelled powerfully of salt and old fish. He stood on the narrow gangplank, the locket burning through the fabric of his coat. He had the location, the cipher, and the object. But how did he initiate the protocol? Was there a password? He looked at Cinder, who stood patiently on the dock beside him, a dark, motionless sentinel. The answer, Elias realized, was not in what he said, but what he showed. The locket was proof, but the mechanism for activating the trust required the protocol. Elias reached into his coat and pulled out the locket. He held it up, letting the faint light catch the gold. He looked at the ship, then down at Cinder. "I need your collar," Elias whispered, his voice catching. He knelt and began the difficult process of unbuckling the thick, rigid leather. It was stiff, requiring all his strength to manipulate the ancient brass buckle. Cinder remained perfectly still, a silent participant in the ritual. Finally, with a soft, groaning sound of aged leather, the collar fell open. Elias lifted the heavy, scarred leather strap. He opened the suede-lined compartment one last time. He took the locket and placed it back inside its nest. The small gold object settled perfectly, a seamless part of the mechanism. He didn't rebuckle the collar around Cinder's neck. Instead, he held the thick leather artifact, the proof of his identity, in his outstretched hands. He had nothing to lose. He had to trust the elaborate, desperate plan his parents had forged. Elias walked slowly up the gangplank, Cinder following closely. He reached the main deck and lifted the heavy collar above his head, holding it toward the cabin door of the trawler. Protocol Gamma 7, Elias stated, his voice thin but firm against the cold morning wind. Elias Vernon Thorne, Eldridge Trust, identification, the collar. He stood, frozen, waiting for the consequence of his gamble. Silence stretched, immense and terrifying. Then, slowly, the heavy wooden cabin door creaked inward. A figure emerged. It was not a menacing gangster or a ruthless lawyer, but a woman. She was older, dressed in thick, practical dark clothing, her face kind but lined with years of hardship and vigilance. Her eyes, however, held an immediate, heartbreaking recognition. She stepped onto the deck and looked past Elias, directly at Cinder. Then her gaze fell upon the heavy leather collar clutched in Elias's hands. A soft, ragged sound escaped her lips. "He found you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She stepped closer, moving with an almost fearful reverence toward the collar. "The leather," she explained, her eyes fixed on the artifact. "It was cured with the oil of the Ethelgard family seals. It carries the weight and the markings. It had to be presented whole. My name is Tessa Vancroft. TSV. She was the guardian, the designated contact." She didn't rush toward Elias, didn't grab the collar. She saw the fear and the exhaustion etched into the boy's face. "Elias," she said softly, "my brother, your father, always knew the risk. He designed this method knowing that only true compassion would activate the protocol. Only someone willing to sacrifice their own last resource for the carrier would ever hold that collar long enough to discover the hidden key." She looked pointedly at Cinder, who had risked its life for the few crumbs Elias had shared. The trust had been placed not in wealth, but in kindness. The act of sharing his last bread was the true key to unlocking his destiny. Tessa finally approached Elias and gently took the heavy collar from his numb fingers. She held it for a moment, a profound relic of sacrifice. "You are safe now, Thorne," she said, her eyes glistening. "Your journey through St. Jude's is over." Elias swayed, his exhaustion finally overpowering him, no longer held at bay by fear or urgency. He sank to his knees on the damp deck. Tessa knelt instantly, catching him. Cinder moved forward and nudged Elias's cheek with a soft, reassuring lick. "Bring the boy below, Cinder," Tessa instructed gently. A command the dog understood perfectly. Cinder nudged Elias, assisting him as Tessa helped lift him, guiding the exhausted boy into the warm, scented cabin of the silent vessel. The world dissolved into the scent of wood smoke, warm broth, and safety. Elias clutched Cinder's sturdy form, the terror of St. Jude's receding like a bad dream. He was not alone. He was not hungry. And the terrible weight of the secret had been lifted, replaced by the immense, quiet certainty of belonging. His last act of shared kindness had delivered him home. The $1 million secret had finally come full circle, resulting not in wealth, but in rescue, companionship, and profound unconditional love. His new life began, enveloped in warmth and the silent, comforting presence of the dog who had carried his fortune on its neck.